Welcome to the Red Letters Podcast. In this podcast, we explore topics that can be life transforming while delivering a message of hope.
Thank you for joining us on this week's episode of Red Letters Podcast. Today we're going to talk about a topic that maybe isn't a hot topic in the church world or anything like that, but it is a commandment that God gave us, and that was to keep the Sabbath holy. And what does that mean? What does it look like? Why is it important? So we're going to kind of dive into that topic and see what we could discover from there and see how important and why it's important. First of all, I know we could start off that it was a commandment that he gave us and that he wants us to rest. But why would you guys say that's important?
Well, Tony, thank you. Well, I think it's important to rest because he commands it, one, and because of everything that we're carrying from the week. And we have to give ourselves that one. I don't think it's supposed to be one day, but we're supposed to give ourselves that time to allow our body to catch up to everything that's going on, if that makes sense. So I think everything that God did was so strategic, and he didn't leave one thing out. It's us that leave things out. It's us that don't take the time to get into his word and rest in him so that we can have that energy and whatever it is that we need to keep going forth. So I just think that it's important for that. But I did want to ask, so the Sabbath, when we talk about that, we're talking, is it a different type of rest or is it just rest in general?
Well, I know like in the Jewish culture, when they were talking about the Sabbath, you couldn't do anything on the Sabbath. That I think even I want to say you couldn't even cook, you couldn't work your animals, you couldn't. It wasn't just for you; it was for your whole household and everything that you own. That don't. That's why they even accused Jesus. Why are you healing on the Sabbath? That was considered work to them, because you're seeing somebody get healed, on the Sabbath, where it's you sit back and you do nothing. You just unplug for the day. Yeah. And why I think it's important. I think a lot of times we go through life so wound up, and anxiety is a big deal. Depression's a big deal. All of these different things that affect our emotions, especially in the world that doesn't know God. They're turning around and have so many diagnoses for all these mental health issues, but it probably could stem from not keeping the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. And I know that we could turn around and look at it like, hey, you have to have that one day of rest. You could look at it like that, like if God's pointing the finger at you, but it's really, he's trying to say, instead of him pointing the finger, he's actually waving you into his rest. Oh, that's good, yeah. So I think that it changes everything about your week as a in its entirety when you're able to turn around and rest. Yeah. You know what I mean? Because like one of the things that was kind of, I might have shared this before on a different episode, but like my uncle, who doesn't even talk about God, any of that stuff, for as long as I can remember, Mondays when he gets home, he unplugs, he rests. And he'll I think eat something super simple as soon as he gets home around 3-4 o'clock, eat a little something, and he goes to sleep until he has to go to work Tuesday morning. Oh, wow. And that's been for like everybody knows Monday night, if you call him, he's not going to answer. Mm-hmm. And I asked him about that because I know the Sabbath exists, and he didn't really know about that, but he ended up telling me, he goes, my body tells me that I have to turn around and unplugged that night so that I could function at 100% the rest of the time. I'm like, man, that's so important that you even realize that. And so here I am thinking, man, God said something about that. Yeah. And sometimes we're wound up because most of the time when we think about that, typically it's either Saturday, if Saturday is considered the Sabbath, but a lot of Christians, we look at it as Sunday. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times when you're involved in church, you in a sense can't rest if you're serving and you're doing the mechanic part of church. Mm-hmm. But I think finding a spot to turn around and find that rest and that peace and that time to even reflect on your relationship with him, I think is so important. but I just don't think we do it as often as we should.
So it's more than rest, Tony. It's not just like sitting down and not doing anything. It's actually sitting down and being in the presence of God.
I would say it's one and the other. I think that you just unplugging and being able to let your body and mind just kind of detox, I think is one side of it. But I think you turning around and reflecting on your week, reflecting on not necessarily having to get ready for Monday kind of thing, but to turn around and reflect and think, okay, what did my last week look like? And to kind of absorb it so that you could project a better week that's up and coming now because you've been able to unplug. That's why a lot of times I feel like, I don't do vacations as often as I should, but I notice that when I unplug for 4 days or more, I actually come back a little refreshed, a little renewed because I was able to detox for a little bit. And one of the things I've noticed, like if it's a 4-day weekend or something that I'm going to unplug, it takes me about a day or two to actually unplug.
Yeah.
And then the last day or two, I could actually enjoy it. But I'm still kind of like have the reservoir of what just finished happening before I went on this 4-day weekend or whatever the vacation is. So I know that rest is more important than we give it credit.
I am so glad that we're covering this topic because I think with so much going on right now in our world, I don't think people take the time. I'm going to be completely vulnerable here because I don't like to be. So now I am. But I have a horrible, horrible habit of not understanding what rest is. Like I don't like it. It doesn't make me feel comfortable. And I've taken, I know I shared this before, probably not on the podcast, or maybe I have, I don't remember because I've shared it before. But growing up, I was do. Like get up, do it, get up. And it was constant. It was so constant that I don't remember sitting there and watching like a whole TV show, cartoons, whatever, because you had to do something. And now in my adult life, really adult life, I find myself getting home and the first thing that I do is look to do something. I don't get home and it's like, okay, you're just going to sit here and relax. I actually literally have to put it down either on my phone or on something and say, Mary, you're going to sit down for 1 hour and just sit down. Like but it's sad for me because I'm like, why can't you naturally do it? And in that hour when I'm sitting there, I'm looking to see in my head, okay, maybe you should do this, and then you got to go fix this, and then you got to go do this, and that's it. So that's not even rest. And this is why we're not fully functioning for God. And that's why I want to put that out there because I see it at my job. I see it with my husband. I see it with the boys. And I see it in everyday life that people are in a hurry to do what? Like you're in such a hurry to do what? And you're not resting. And this is where, Tony, when you said earlier, the depression comes in, the anxiety comes in, other sicknesses overtake you because your body hasn't had time to replenish itself from everything that it's going through. And we're so caught up on doing something, and in reality, we're not doing anything. So I'm glad we're covering this topic. And I think it's so important for the listener. If you're one of those crazy people like myself, like I don't know how to sit still and just sit still. We were talking about worship earlier, and I love worship. And when you sit there, because in that moment, I know I can't do anything. Like even if I wanted to clean, I can't. I have to, but I have had to force myself to get into this mindset that you are here and this is all you're going to do. My point is that it takes work to do that, and it shouldn't be like that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about those crazy people you just mentioned.
Yes.
Why I think that exists. It just as you were talking, because I kind of feel the same way on how I grew up, is that when we're raised not understanding and knowing to honor the Sabbath, we don't reproduce that. So that's why it's so much work, because we weren't raised learning how important rest is. Right. So here's a question kind of to you and to everyone here. I know it applied for me, but because we probably, or let me rephrase that. Would you say that growing up, you had to perform for your parents?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. That's, I think, a whole dynamic that trained our mind to grow up and do, because you can't sit down because you're not being productive. Exactly. And that used to be an anthem I used to say in my own home, I'd tell my wife, my kid, we need to be productive. Da, da, da. And man, that was a battle all the time. And I didn't realize that I didn't need to do that. I was just regurgitating what I had learned. So it was actually a bad behavior that I couldn't enter into that. And even now, it's still like you, I have a challenge with that. If I go to take a nap, it's hard for me to do that. And if I do, I feel guilty.
Yes.
And because I can't just unplug, because there's something I have to be doing. My to-do task is growing. It's not shrinking.
Right.
And I have to perform. And sometimes we carry that over into our church world as well, that I got so many things I got to get done, even for the things of, the church or with God, that I got to get all this stuff done, get my to-do list, even with him checked off, before I could actually sit back and relax. Yeah. And if we realize that that's never going to go away, you're always going to have a to-do list. Like you said, you're on a treadmill running, but you ain't going nowhere. Exactly. You know what I mean? So I think rest is big time important.
I feel like how you said like about performing, I think you actually perform better when you're rested. Yeah. But I like going to what you said, Mary, how you have a hard time, like, not doing something when you get home. Do you guys think it's like where people have a hard time being in the quiet? It almost like it's uneasy. And I think the quiet, there's a lot of good. And I think God can speak louder when your life is quiet, because everyone's so busy with life and the noise of life that when you are forced to, have nothing to do, maybe you're like, your to-dos are all done. You're like, what am I going to do now? And it's almost like scary to just face almost like, okay, you have to God's sitting at a table, and then you're like, preparing like Martha, getting all this stuff ready. And then there's Mary who's just sitting at his feet. And this is the one thing she recognizes that this is her everything, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think sitting with the quiet. What do you guys think about that?
That's a perfect story to illustrate that.
The Martha and Mary story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the quiet, Gio. If you ever walk into my house, again, crazy, it's so quiet when I'm by myself, and I enjoy it. Very rarely when I'm alone, I'll put worship music, but I enjoy that alone time. The busyness is what I'm working on it. I'm really working on it. So my husband will get home and he has to turn on TVs, radio, stuff is going on all over the house. I'm like, what is going on? Like, why do we have to have noise constantly? But coming into the home on those rare occasions when I am by myself, I enjoy it. But I can't sit still, if that makes sense. I have to constantly be telling myself, do something. But I have learned, if there's people in the living room, my family, in the living room or stuff, I will go to my bathroom, shut everything out, and sit there. And I say, I have to do this because I have to do this. But I want to get to a point that I get to do this because I get to do this. Yeah. So I don't know if that's a difference, but but the alone time, I get where you're coming from, because I think a lot of us struggle with that.
I think for something I'm still trying to work on, because I feel like it's hard for me to sit an hour and just be quiet, not even praying, just just listening to nothing, no worship music. But one thing when we're talking about Sabbath, how the noise of life and everything like that, I think the Sabbath too, when God, after he created 6 days of creating the universe, he rested, and it could possibly be that, he took that time to just enjoy it. Before everything started, before he had to do set in motion the plan of redemption, he's like, okay, let me just take a breath, because I know I got my work cut out for me. But I think, a lot of the times, Jesus said, today has its own worries. Just worry about today. Don't start thinking, because that's when anxiety and all that comes in, and we've talked about that. But just to stop and smell the roses in a way,
I like what you said when I was just thinking about Genesis, because that's where we get the Sabbath, was when God created the heavens and the earth and everything in it. And then on the seventh day, he rested. Rested doesn't necessarily mean you quit cold turkey and you just sit still for that whole day and do nothing. I believe I know in Judaism, they believe in you cease from all work. You don't do anything, right? But in Christianity, it's different. So I think of God when he's sitting down and resting. I don't believe he just quit, he wasn't doing nothing. He was sitting down and just taking in what he just created and enjoying it. Just like you said, he was just sitting there like, wow, because everything he counted it all good, right? And I think that with us in general, it doesn't mean to just quit cold turkey and to rest. And, it means to get away from busy life. Yeah. It's set apart because God says, let the Sabbath be holy, right? Holy, set apart unto him, giving him worship, reverencing him, spending time with him, spending time with your family in him. It's not just, you know what, I'm going to sleep today, I'm going to shut everybody out. No, that's because we get so busy in the 6 days of the week that we forget. And if that's the only time that you could sit down and give God you, and even give you to your family in him, with him, then that's to me what the Sabbath is. And it's not, and I know some people say, you have to, live by, you have to set apart that day, it's God's commandment. But look at Jesus and the disciples. When the disciples were hungry and they were picking on the Sabbath, they were picking wheat. And then here comes the Pharisees. They confront Jesus, like, what are you doing? This is a Sabbath, whatever. But I wanted to share the scripture in Mark 2:27-20. It says, then Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, not the people meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. So it was to meet the needs of the people. And you think about that for a moment, to meet the needs, right? So here's the disciples, I'm hungry. But the religiously, you can't eat on the Sabbath. You can't pick wheat on the Sabbath. They were so religious, selfish, that they weren't thinking about anything else. But Jesus said, no, here's a need. They're hungry.
So we're falling like into a religious mindset when we refuse to rest because it looks a certain way. Or
Right.
we refuse. Okay, so.
Because they've taken the Sabbath and made it more a requirement, like a ritual, than it is to think about. If you think about and you read all the scriptures regarding Sabbath, Sabbath is a beautiful thing. Yeah. We take for granted. If it's the only, think about it, and I was thinking about this a lot, even last night, actually, because I said, I have a feeling we're going to end up here. And I was thinking, Lord, help me with the Sabbath, because I know we've never really practiced the Sabbath. But as I was thinking about it, I was like, Lord, and it took me back to creation, and it took me back to just even watching The Chosen, about little clips there regarding, what the Pharisees did, like a visual on what that looked like. And I think that, you're not going to go to hell because you aren't practicing the Sabbath. I just want to let you know that, you know what I mean? God's not going to condemn you, because we as Christians, we think that we have to, we're adopted into the kingdom of God, right? Mm-hmm. But we have to keep in mind, we're Gentiles adopted into the kingdom of God through Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. But we're really not required to go along with a lot of these things that the Jews are required to do, because they know. And Paul even addressed it with Peter when it came to confronting him about him eating with the Gentiles, doing one thing, but behind everybody else's back, he was doing something else. You know what I mean? And Paul said, or no, I'm sorry, take that back, reverse that. It was, I believe, there was a disciple that they wanted to have circumcised. Mm-hmm. And Paul confronted Peter about the circumcision, because by law they had to be circumcised in order to be a part of the family or adopted into the kingdom, right? So they were still going by religious law, whereas Paul was saying, no, it's about the circumcision of the heart, not the flesh. Right. And I think sometimes we, as Christians, we try to, we try to bring Judaism back into Christianity, when no, we can't do that.
Yeah, well, on that verse that you shared in another translation, it says that the Sabbath was made for man. Man wasn't made for the Sabbath. Yeah. So 100%, it's not supposed to be this a do or die, whether you have acceptance with God. But God, in his wisdom, knew that the Sabbath we were going to need. Yeah. So that we needed to partake of it. But I wouldn't say that it's something that Christians shouldn't adhere to, because it is one of the 10 commandments. So he didn't just say that to let it fade away, because otherwise we could murder and we could water that down too. But what I'm trying to say is it shouldn't be, almost like Mary was saying, it shouldn't be a have to, but it's a I get to. Yeah. I think that's the heart posture we should have towards this. That we should actually look towards trying to do that, because it's good for us and it would be a good part of a weekly practice. But it shouldn't be such a ritual that, there's issues that come up because, no, I got to turn around and I got to have my Sabbath. I don't care if it rubs you the wrong way. We're just going to, you know what I mean? So I think it's the heart posture on wanting to partake of it because Father said this is what you should do. So that's more where I think that's the filter we should use, because we can't just dismiss it. I don't think that that's the right way to handle that. We do need to adhere to it, but it's the heart posture by which we choose to do that.
And I agree with that. But there's some believers that will turn around and condemn you and basically tell you that, hey, you're sinning and you're not gonna, you know what I mean? Yeah. Because you're not practicing it. And I'm not saying that you are if you don't. I'm not encouraging not to 100%, because Jesus went back and said, out of all the commandments, these are the most important of the two to do. And that's to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself. But I do agree with you.
Yeah, but what I'm kind of getting at too is, let's just say your Sabbath is Mondays. The Mondays, that's the day you get off, that you could actually use that day of your rest. Mm-hmm. What I'm trying to say is we don't have to get so mechanical that it has to be on the Saturday.
I agree.
We need to create a Sabbath, but what that looks like to each and every person could look different. Right. But being able to create a time and a space to sit back, reflect, to turn around and just be in his presence, like you said, to do family time at the highest level with no interruptions, stuff like that is, I think, the end goal of what the Sabbath is supposed to accomplish.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Tony, because what I was going to ask was, so what happens to those of us who actually go to church every Sunday? Some of us serve in 2 services, not me, some people do. What does the Sabbath look like to somebody like, okay, you've already worked all week, you've gone to work. The reason I ask this is because I had told myself a long time ago, because I noticed what was happening with me. I didn't want church to become something that was checked off on my list. I didn't want church to be, I didn't want it to be something that was routine. I wanted it to be something that was me. Mm-hmm. But I do hear people say, but I have this, and this to do. And they also include church in it. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, what does it look like to somebody who serves on Wednesdays, somebody who serves on Sundays? And what does a Sabbath look like to you? And you said pick a Monday, or, even if you work on that Monday. So I'm just curious. I'm putting it out there.
Well, I was kind of saying, like, if that happened to be your day off, and you could better utilize that day out of the 7 to have that time. But let's just say it's, like Sunday, if you go to a church that don't have a Sunday night service, you use that second half of Sunday to just unplug. And maybe you do the same thing with Saturday. So that you try to accumulate maybe a day or close to that, even if you have to divide it up, to try to make sure you're making that space for, your Sabbath to take place. Because I know, like, we have a leader in our church that he had told me, him and his wife, they acknowledge the Sabbath, and they're doing their best to partake of that regularly. So he goes, on Saturdays, that's when we do it. So if you reach out to me and you need something, just know that I'm probably not going to respond. Hey, no problem. So I do my best not even to text him anything, because I see that that's what he's trying to do on the regular. Mm-hmm. And I applaud him for that. I think that's amazing. They use that for family time and all that. So I was like, man, in a good way, I was almost jealous man, that's amazing. You know what I mean? So I salute that. And I think that that's an amazing, because we have to learn how to balance work and rest. Yes. And that's, like we mentioned earlier, that's a struggle that I have sometimes. Mm-hmm. But if we don't understand where that balance, we end up, out of alignment in every area of our life, because I don't know how many times just raising our family where work was everything, to unplug was not going to be. And there's so much, there was so much family time that I didn't carve out that later on I regretted. Right. So, that's still something I'm trying to work towards. But I think being able to balance those two things is a big thing. And I think one of the things that would help with that regarding your work and regarding your church life, if you're active in church and serving, is you need to set boundaries for yourself.
Right.
Because if you set boundaries, that's going to help you navigate and carve out those times of rest. But if you just, I'm going to say it, and this might sound kind of rough, but this is either, again, in the workplace and even in the church life. If you're a yes man or a yes woman, forget it. You're never going to have a rest. And then it goes back to something I frequently say is you deserve what you tolerate. So if you're going to choose to say yes to everything that's taking place, and you're going to be available for every activity, you want to be a part of everything, and you don't ever want to carve that time out, then guess what? You deserve to be frustrated. You deserve to be a complainer. You deserve to have a tainted attitude towards work and your church life because you don't want to make that choice I have to have a boundary. You know what? I can do it this time, but I can't do it over here. Right. And I've had chosen to not be a yes man, because I used to be that in church, where now if I can, I can. If I can't, I can't. And I just try to communicate at the highest level. And hey, this is where I'm at. I can. If I can't, here's the reason why. Don't think it's because I don't want to be a part of it. Right. I just have other obligations I got to make sure are a priority as well.
Do you think it's safe to say, hearing what you're saying, that it could even fall into the category of like fear of man at times? Because I think if we prioritize pleasing people, that could affect how we're pleasing the Lord sometimes. Yeah. And so it's kind of like, I'm just thinking about it now. It's like, if we have the fear of the Lord, I almost feel like it would be easier to take Sabbaths, because you realize, like, the first time holy is mentioned in the Bible, when you're reading it from Genesis to Revelation, is he says the Sabbath is holy. Mm-hmm. That's the first time it's mentioned. And so it shows you a significance that God put on the Sabbath. Yes, like you said, Mom, like the two main commandments, but I wouldn't discredit that he called it holy. So I'm like, there's something profound that the Lord's, him being perfect and creating perfection, when he created us, he knew that our bodies, not just spiritually, but physically, needed rest. Mm-hmm. Because you think about people who get diagnosed with all these things, or they get sick. Mm-hmm. And then one of the first things I hear doctors ask is, well, how's your sleep? Like, do you, Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's like, there is something really beautiful that the Lord shows us. And like, I created you for this. Okay. So don't do this without this. Yes, exactly. And then you find us in a hustle culture. So we're like, do. Mm-hmm. But the Lord's, I created you. Yes, do your work, till the ground, but also take time to refresh yourself in me. Mm-hmm. And something I think about is a couple, like, years ago, and it's something the Lord's been convicting me about recently to like practice again. But every night at 9:00 was like my God time. Mm-hmm. So my mom knew for a while, after 9:00, she didn't ask me anything, because I was like, this is my time to read and pray. Mm-hmm. And I would just tell the Lord, I was like, Lord, from 9 till you want me to go to bed, it's your time. Mm-hmm. Because I didn't have the whole weekend, because it would be family time or whatever. And then I'd have work. So even though I didn't give him a whole day, I saw the fruit of that little momentary Sabbath every single day, and I saw it affect my whole life. Wow. So I do think there is something that shouldn't be overlooked, I guess, yeah, or even just prioritizing, because I think balance is great, but also prioritizing is important. And so it's prioritizing rest. And yes, I think family time is great, but I do also think that rest includes seclusion between you and the Lord, to spend time with him alone, because without that, you're going to be emptying out yourself to people, and then you're just going to be, that's where burnout, all that stuff comes from. So I feel like prioritizing it is important, No,
I think that's 100% true. But actually, going back to what you said about the fear of man, I think that's a whole lot linked to the yes man syndrome, because a lot of times, and you see it all the time, where a pastor is leading their church, all of a sudden the pastor's not there, so a lot of people leave because their eyes were on the pastor. It wasn't necessarily on God. So I think that turning around and having a fear of God should always supersede having a fear of anybody in authority, in a higher position, anything. And that goes to the workplace and in the church life, because a lot of times people will look at their pastors or their church leaders as a representation of God, when they reflect God maybe in some way, shape, or form, and maybe God put them in in an authoritative position, but they don't sit on the throne. The one who sits on the throne is the one we have to give the ultimate priority towards. And our ultimate fear, a healthy fear, should come from knowing who he is and who he is in our life and what he's able to do. You know what I mean? I think that's important, because if we don't turn around and kind of adjust that filter, it can help us make the wrong decisions, the wrong choices, and then we find ourselves putting the equivalent all-powerful God into the person you happen to be looking at, or you're calling pastor, you're calling your leader. So we need to make sure we don't blur those lines, because you find yourself in trouble when you do, because it's just an unhealthy way of living your life.
And it's just really unhealthy when people want to be people pleasers. Like, that is so huge. Like, when we constantly, that and the need to be needed. Yeah. Oh my goodness, the need to be needed. That causes so much stuff just with your mental state and your physical body. So it's important to know the difference, and it's important for the listener out there. It's important to rest. Like, stress will get you and break you, especially when you don't have the right type of rest. And rest just means, like, whatever it looks like to you, like just disconnecting. Tony, I love when you said that, but yeah, just disconnecting. But I don't think a lot of us know how to do that. Like, it doesn't come natural to a lot of us, because we're constantly on in our mind. Our body is sitting there, finally, we say physically resting, but our mind is still going 100 miles an hour. And that's a discipline that I think is so unnatural to me, but I long for the day when I can be there, where it's like a disciplined mind where you just sit there and literally just rest. Yeah.
And I know we talked about balance, prioritizing, and I know we talked about boundaries, but another one too is to limit your distractions. Yeah. During that time that you're setting aside to be alone with God first and foremost. And that probably the first thing that comes to mind is the phone. You know, getting that and either turning it off, or don't even let it be in the room so you're tempted to pick it up. Yeah. That could actually help you enter into this thing called rest and or the Sabbath when you turn around and even if you have to go drive down, if you're in a house that's super chaotic, and it doesn't have to be in a negative way, it just where it's real noisy and it's just hard to focus. If you have to jump in your car and go around the corner because the beach is too far or whatever, then so be it. You'll turn around and see the fruit of it, like you said, Ruth, you know, as you make that a habit and a culture for the way you choose to live your life. But I think limiting distractions is another big important thing to make sure that you solidify that time that you're offering to your Father. Mm-hmm. And to the person that's listening, that this is all a foreign language, like what's
like
this
rest?
thing?
What do you mean?
Yeah, because we don't like. I think this is going to stink and sound bad, but I'm going to say it anyway. In the church world, we don't like to talk about the Sabbath because we like to keep people busy. Yeah. And that's a fact. Mm-hmm. And we don't like to preach that because then people aren't available when we need them. Mm-hmm. We don't like to say that or teach that because then people aren't accessible anymore. Yeah. And we like to be able to call somebody, they answer. We need them, they respond. Yeah. You need help, they show up. Mm-hmm. And I think that we've done a disservice to the people of God because we turn around and have our agenda sometimes and our to-do, and we just need to make sure everyone's accessible at the drop of a dime. Yes. And I think that that's something we should actually be careful about. I know it applies in the workplace, but I had to bring up the church part because it's a thing. Yeah. And we don't like to talk about it.
But also the members have to take accountability for themselves, Tony, because a lot of people want to stay busy for whatever reason. They don't feel safe not being busy because, you know, of what has happened in the past or what they've gotten themselves into. So they make themselves busy, but then they make it a religion. They don't make it a relationship with God. Yeah. So it's so important that we know the difference. I'm going to share this with you guys. So there's a coworker that I have, which I think is so interesting because, you know, I'm going to talk about her again tomorrow, but it's so interesting because you look at what some people do, and because it it hits you the wrong way, not because it's bad, but because it's so right that it doesn't make sense to you. So my coworker takes 2 days out of the month, every month. She's like, I earned the time. I'm taking 2 days off. And she does it. We would look up and where's this girl? Well, she's on another vacation, or she just didn't show up to the office. And because we make a lot of time, either sick time or vacation time, our job gives it, they're pretty generous with that. So every month she's gone for 2 days out of the month, her days off or whatever. And I went to her office and I said, what are you doing? She's like, I don't really care what anybody else thinks, Mary. She goes, this is my time and I completely disconnect for 2 days out of the month. I don't worry about work. I don't worry about anything else. I just simply disconnect. And to me, that doesn't make any sense because you're not supposed to do that. Like, you're not supposed to do that. Who do you think you are? But as I sit there and I watch her and I listen to her, I'm like, she's healthy. She's happy. She has a relationship with God. It may not look like my relationship with God, but I look at her and I'm like, this is awesome. Like, why and how? Like, in my head, it doesn't compute that this is supposed to be okay. And I was talking to my husband yesterday, and one of my uncles his uncles is going through something, and he said, we're going to do this. And I look at him, and my husband's another one that you have to rest and you have to work out and he's so okay with it, and it doesn't bother him. Like for me, I'm like, why are you just sitting there? And he's like, I'm working out. I don't get it. To me, it doesn't make sense, but this is the reality that we live in, that because it doesn't make sense to you, now you sit back and you judge somebody for actually taking care of themselves, for actually looking at the Sabbath and saying, it may not look like what it looks like to me, but actually taking those 2 days to disconnect and be one with nature, be one with the universe, be one with whatever it looks like to you. But some of us will judge. And I think a lot, either your employer or the church will do that because, wait, he wasn't available to me. And it's like, no, you have every right to do that because it's already in God's word. He said, take the time. And I don't think he does it to be selfish. I think he does it once again to pour into us those things that we need to keep us functioning to do the will of God. But so many of us look back, it's like, why is she doing that? I'm big on that. I was like, why does she think she can take a day off? Because she's earned it. But I tell my husband, I'm like, you got up and just worked out. You didn't think to put the dishes away. You didn't think to do laundry. He said, no, I did not think of any of that, and I'm not. And to me, and I'm talking to the wives and relationships out there, if your spouse, if your significant other takes pride in taking care of himself, his mental health, his physical health, and we don't, you can't hold that against that person. Like, you can't sit there and be like, you're wrong for actually resting. No, I'm wrong for not resting myself, and I can't blame somebody else, if that makes sense.
No, it's funny when you brought up the coworker. The first thing I was going to ask you a question after, but you answered the question. I was going to say, what does her life look like? So you did answer it all. Yeah. And I think there's a couple of things too that we could add. Is that one, people could abuse the Sabbath and roll that over to where they're not really utilizing it the way they're supposed to. They're using that as an excuse to be productive. Right. So some people can take it to the extreme, and I think that's an unhealthy balance. But going back to the workplace, another thing that came to my mind is I was reading or going through this book earlier this week, and it turned around and was saying that if you had 2 employees and one was a yes man or yes woman, and they were always available to do everything, and then you had this other person that knew when to say yes and when to say no, that the supervisor, if a promotion came up, 9 times out of 10, they would pick the one that knows when to say yes and no, because they have their identity, they have boundaries, and they're going to know how to navigate that and to manage other people because of that. Over here, they're going to be going to extremes. Yeah. And I was like, wow, that's so amazing to even think that there's a subliminal message behind it, watching somebody and how they choose to live their life and to say yes or no and how to balance all that rest even.
That's so good. So with that being said today, that was a great topic. I'm so glad we covered rest and the Sabbath. Make sure that you guys do get the rest. It's good for your mental health, for your physical health. And yeah, just be one with God. Take that time for yourself. You'll just bring more fruit out of it. Thank you so much. Can't wait to talk to you again.